The sky was still bleeding fire. Smoke curled low to the ground, thick and bitter, like old ash soaked in fuel. The wind moved in slow, confused gusts, dragging along scraps of torn banners and melted steel. The battlefield didn't groan anymore. It was quiet now. Quiet in that wrong kind of way. The kind that usually meant death was the only thing left standing. Rena stepped over a scorched ridge of stone, her boots crunching softly against blackened debris. Her breathing mask buzzed faintly as it filtered the air, struggling to keep out the poison that still hung in the ruins. Her silver-blue skin was streaked with dirt and scratches, but she moved like a ghost, low, silent, eyes sharp as carved crystal. Her mission was simple: find survivors. If human, terminate. That last part echoed in her mind, like it always did. Cold, efficient, logical. Her kind had trained for this war since birth, and Rena was one of the best scouts they had. A tracker, a silent ghost, she could kill with a whisper. But as she crept through the skeletal remains of the outpost, something in the silence felt off, not empty, occupied. A flicker, movement in the corner of her eye. She turned fast, weapon drawn. There, beneath a collapsed support beam, half buried in rubble and shadow, was a figure, human. He was pinned, one leg trapped beneath the jagged weight of a broken walkway. His helmet had been tossed aside, blood matted his dark hair, and his armor looked like it had lost a fight with a meteor storm. His right arm hung at a strange angle, twisted, broken, and still, he looked up at her with steady eyes. "You here to finish me off?" he asked. His voice was dry, tired, but not afraid. Rena raised her plasma pistol. Her finger rested on the trigger. He didn't reach for anything, didn't move. He just watched her, like he was studying a passing cloud. "I don't want to fight," he said. His tone was low, calm, not pleading. "You're human," she said, almost to herself. "And you're not," he replied, trying to smile. "So, are you going to shoot me, or help me?" Rena's grip tightened. Her mind screamed enemy. Her orders were clear, but something in his eyes unsettled her. Not weakness, not even defiance. It was stillness. Then he did something that shattered the quiet. He reached for his broken arm. "No," Rena said, before she could stop herself. Too late. With a sharp inhale, the man grabbed his forearm and pulled. The sound that followed was not human. A snap echoed through the ruins, like a gunshot against a canyon wall. Rena froze. She had seen wounds before, burns, blood, even slow death. But never had she seen someone reset their own shattered limb with nothing but grit and bone-deep will. The man, Cade, screamed. But it wasn't weakness. It wasn't pain that begged to stop. It was a roar, a sound that pushed pain aside and dared the universe to do worse. Rena stared, and then the world tilted. Her vision blurred, her knees buckled. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the human leaning back against the stone, his breath ragged, his eyes still open. The monster she had been told to fear hadn't even flinched. Darkness had fallen like a slow curtain. The red haze of the sky had given way to night. True night, cold and sharp, draped in silence so deep it pressed against the skin. When Rena opened her eyes, she didn't know where she was at first. The battlefield was gone. So was the roar of plasma fire. The only sound now was the faint crackle of flames licking at broken metal. She sat up fast, heart hammering. Her hand reached instinctively for her weapon, but it wasn't there. Her breath caught, then she felt it. Warmth. Beneath her, not ground. Something softer. A makeshift pillow fashioned from torn armor plating and scraps of human clothing. She blinked, trying to focus, trying to make sense of the firelight dancing across the broken walls of a half-collapsed ruin. And there, leaning against a slab of stone near the flames, was the human, Cade. His arm was bound tightly with cloth. His leg, still pinned earlier, was now braced with a stick and a length of twisted wire. Blood darkened his shirt, but his eyes were open, calm as before. You're awake, he said. Rena stared at him in disbelief. Why didn't you kill me? She asked. He shrugged slowly, like the question had no weight. Didn't seem right. You passed out. Couldn't just leave you. But I'm your enemy, she said quietly. He looked away for a second, then back. Yeah, and I'm yours. Funny how neither of us finished the job. The fire popped. Rena's stomach growled loud enough for both of them to hear. Cade didn't laugh. He just reached into a small pouch beside him and tossed something her way. A sealed packet. Human rations. Probably decades old. Probably barely edible. She caught it, hesitated, then tore it open and began to chew. It tasted like dust and oil. But her hunger didn't care. Who are you? She asked between bites. Cade, he said. Just Cade. And you? Rena hesitated. She had been trained not to share names. Identity was weakness. Connection was a trap. But something in his tone made her answer. Rena. He smiled, a real smile. Tired, lopsided, but honest. Nice to meet you, Rena. She didn't smile back. Not yet. But she watched him carefully. The way he leaned against the stone. The way his fingers trembled from pain, but never reached for help. The way his jaw clenched every few minutes, not from fear, but endurance. How did you do that? She asked, voice barely above a whisper. What? Your arm, earlier. Cade looked down at the crude wrap, flexed his fingers slightly, winced. No choice, he said. No one else was gonna fix it. You weren't taught how? He shook his head. You don't wait for someone to teach you out here. You just figure it out, or you die. Rena looked away, her expression unreadable. Her people had feared humans for their violence. But now, she feared something else. Their refusal to break. Their ability to suffer without surrender. Their strength wasn't just muscle. It was something harder to kill. Cade didn't speak. He just leaned back and looked up at the stars, as if they were old friends. So, he said finally, voice quiet, you gonna kill me now? Rena looked at her empty hands, then at his broken body. Then she shook her head. No. He nodded slowly. Good. 'Cause I can't run very fast right now. A beat passed, and Rena laughed, just a little. Just enough to surprise them both. And in that broken, impossible place, in the warmth of stolen firelight, two enemies sat beneath a sky full of silent stars, and something else began. The wind changed sometime after midnight. It came quietly at first, a gentle shift in the air, then sharper, colder, more insistent. The fire burned low, its embers pulsing faint red against the surrounding rubble. The world had gone still again. Only the wind remained, weaving between broken steel, whispering across the bones of machines and men. Rena was asleep. Her head rested on the makeshift armor pillow Cade had set earlier. Her body curled tightly, arms wrapped around herself, trying to trap whatever heat she still had left. But her alien skin was not made for this kind of chill. Not this kind of human night. Her breathing grew uneven. Her fingers twitched. She was shivering even in her sleep. Cade noticed. He had never really fallen asleep. Pain had kept him tethered to the edge of unconsciousness. Every heartbeat pulsed through his shoulder like a warning. But when he saw her shivering, saw her curled up so small, trying not to freeze, he pushed himself up. Every movement hurt. His legs screamed. His back ached. But he dragged himself across the cold stone floor, 1 inch at a time. His jacket came off first, then what remained of his armor plates. He placed them gently around her, then pressed his own body close. Careful, steady, not touching her too much, just enough to share warmth. She didn't stir, not yet. He lay beside her in silence, breathing slow, letting the cold soak into his bones so it wouldn't find hers. When morning came, a pale blue light filtered in through a gap in the broken wall. Rena stirred. Her eyes opened, and the first thing she saw was his face. Too close. She tensed instantly, her hand reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. He didn't flinch. Hey, Cade said softly, voice hoarse. Easy, you were freezing. She looked down. She was wrapped in his coat, his armor, his body heat. Her breath caught again, but this time not from panic. "You're injured," she said, confused. "So were you," he replied. "Didn't want you to die in your sleep. That would have ruined the conversation we were having." She sat up slowly, pulling the coat tighter around herself. Her heart beat faster, but not from fear. "Why do you keep helping me?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. Then, finally, he looked up at the collapsed ceiling and said, "Because someone helped me once, when they didn't have to." The silence returned, not awkward, just heavy with things unsaid. Rena rose to her feet. Her legs were stiff, her body sore, but her mind was clearer now. She scanned the ruin around them, shattered bunkers, twisted metal, ash piled high where buildings used to be. They were still alone. No rescue, no patrols, only each other. Cade had rekindled the fire using scraps from his broken helmet and wires from a power cell. 2 ration packs lay nearby, one untouched, left neatly for her. She picked it up. "I could have left you," she said. "I know. I still could." He nodded. "You still can." But she didn't move. Instead, she sat beside him slowly, carefully, like someone testing the depth of strange water. Then she asked the one question that had been burning in her since the moment he reset his own broken arm. "What do you really want?" Cade didn't look at her. For a long time, he just stared into the fire. Then he spoke. "To make it home," he said. "Same as you." A sound in the dark made them both freeze, low, a growl. Cade moved first. Fast. Too fast for someone with a ruined leg. He snatched up his rifle and pointed it toward the shadows. Rena rose beside him, gripping a piece of sharpened metal she had scavenged earlier. The growl grew louder, eyes in the dark. 1, 2, yellow. Not from his world. Not from hers either. Something else had come from the Ashlands. Hungry. Predators. "Stay behind me," Cade said through clenched teeth. "No," Rena answered, stepping beside him. "I fight too." And as the first creature lunged toward them, long limbs, teeth like broken glass, firelight met steel and blood. They weren't soldiers anymore. They were something else, something that stood side by side against the dark. The first beast hit the ground with a sickening thud. Cade's blaster smoked in his hands, its energy core buzzing with heat. He didn't wait to see if the thing was dead. He turned, eyes already scanning for the next. The second came faster. It sprang from the shadows like a spear made of bone and hunger, aiming not for Cade, but for Rena. She didn't scream. She didn't flinch. She moved. The shard of metal in her hand glinted just once before she drove it upward with both arms. The beast slammed into her chest, but she held her ground, feet skidding across the dirt. Its claws tore into her shoulder as her blade punched into its side. Black blood sprayed in long arcs across the ruin. The beast hissed, one last sound, and collapsed beside her, twitching. Rena stood over it, breath ragged, hands shaking. Cade rushed to her, limping hard, his rifle sweeping the dark. "You okay?" he asked, panting. Rena turned toward him slowly. Her eyes were wide, but focused. Her arms were red, not her blood. She looked down. Cade's side was bleeding again. A fresh wound, reopened by the fight. "You're hurt," she said, voice flat but urgent. He gave her a crooked smile. "Just reopened the same one. Happens." Rena grabbed his arm. "Sit." He didn't argue. She pulled him toward the fire and eased him down against the stone wall. His breathing was uneven now, shallow. Sweat clung to his forehead. She knelt beside him and opened the small pouch she'd found on his belt. Basic human field kit. Not much. Gauze, a cracked syringe, a needle too dull to matter. Her hands hovered, unsure. "You know what you're doing?" Cade asked, his tone light. "No," Rena said honestly. "But I'll figure it out." She tore the shirt open near the wound. It was bad. Deep. Unclean. Her hands moved carefully, pressing cloth into torn flesh. Cade tensed, a grunt slipping through his teeth, but he didn't pull away. Her touch was gentle, too gentle for a soldier. She had trained her whole life to fight humans, not to heal them. And yet here she was, his blood on her hands, his life beneath her fingers. She looked up and met his eyes. "You need rest," she said. "So do you," he replied, eyelids heavy. "I'll keep watch." And she did. She sat beside him as the fire shrank into soft orange coals. She held her shard like a blade across her knees, her back straight, her ears tuned to every whisper in the night. Cade leaned against the rock behind her, one hand over his stomach, the other limp at his side. His head drooped slowly until it rested near her shoulder. He slept, and Rena stayed awake, not as a scout, not as a soldier, but as a guardian. Far above them, a drone passed silently through the clouds, its sensors recording everything. And miles away, across the edge of the battlefield, a cold voice crackled through a comm. "We found them," it said. "Send a ship." It began with a whisper, not a scream, not a growl, just the soft sound of something scraping stone. A wrongness in the air, like metal against bone, like breath held too long. Rina opened her eyes. The fire had dwindled to ash. The world was cold again. Cade slept beside her, pale and still, his skin damp with sweat. He hadn't stirred in hours. His pulse was slow, too slow. Then she heard it again, scrape, crunch, closer. She reached for her weapon, but not fast enough. Something lunged from the dark. She barely had time to inhale before Cade's arm was around her waist, yanking her down, rolling his body over hers. Claws tore through the air where her throat had been. Cade's back arched as the beast's talons raked across it. No scream, just a deep guttural growl as Cade spun, firing twice into the monster's chest. It dropped like wet metal. Rina lay frozen under him, her breath shallow. He looked down at her, face twisted in pain, but his eyes, those stubborn human eyes, still watched her, like she was the only thing that mattered. "You okay?" he asked, voice raw. She nodded slowly, but before she could speak, another hiss rose behind them. A second beast. Cade tried to stand, but his leg buckled. He fell to one knee, blaster raised, but too slow. This time, Rina moved first. She threw herself between him and the oncoming creature, her blade raised high. With a scream that split the silence, she met the beast head on. One stab, two. Blood sprayed her arms, her face, her chest. But she didn't stop, didn't flinch. The creature fell at her feet. Silence returned, broken only by heavy breaths. Cade collapsed against the stone, blood running down his side. "You saved me," he whispered, surprised. Rina dropped to her knees beside him. Her hands trembled. "You did it first." His eyes fluttered. She pulled him toward the remnants of the fire, holding him upright as best she could. His body was cold, too cold. The wound was worse than before. She knew he wouldn't last long. Without thinking, she ran toward the wreckage of her scout ship. Its shell was still twisted, but among the burnt panels, she found what she needed: a small silver box, singed but intact. Inside, a vial of gel. Not made for humans, not tested, but better than nothing. She returned to him, ripped his shirt away from the wound, and pressed the gel in place. He groaned. Then, he laughed, weak and breathless. "You're full of surprises." She didn't smile. She was terrified. When the bleeding slowed, Cade leaned back, eyelids heavy. "Back home," he muttered, "they say your kind is smarter, better, but cold, no feelings." She looked down at her hands, shaking, bloodied. "Do I look cold to you?" He looked up, shook his head. "You look real." She didn't know what to say, so she said nothing. Hours passed. Cade slept again. Rina watched. Then, a sound. A soft beep. She looked down. Her distress beacon. Somehow, in the chaos, it had been triggered. Green light blinked slow and steady. Help was coming. Her people. They would save her and kill him. She turned to look at the human sleeping beside her, his breath slow, his hand curled near his face, like a child trying to dream. He had risked everything for her, bled for her, shielded her, fought beside her, and now, Rhina stared at the blinking light. Her thumb hovered over the controls. She made a choice. She pressed the emergency medical code, not the pickup call. A different signal. Priority rescue with allied casualty. If they ask, she whispered, I'll lie. I'll tell them you saved me. That I owe you everything. Cade stirred faintly. His eyes opened just enough to see her face. Thank you, he said. Then his eyes closed again. And for the first time since the war began, Rhina felt fear, not of dying, but of losing him. The rescue ship came down from the clouds like a god of metal and fire, roaring against the sky. She didn't move. She lay over him as the landing thrusters blasted the air to dust. She was done running. She had already crossed the line. Now she would stand on it. The door slammed shut behind her. Cold steel echoed through the chamber like thunder underwater. Rhina stood alone now, her boots pressed to the center of the hall, where the floor bore no color, no cracks, no emotion, just polished silence. The walls curved high above her, lined with ancient banners of her people. At the far end, raised on a platform of silver and stone, the High Council sat, 7 faces, unblinking, unmoving, beside Rhina, an empty chair where Cade should have been. Instead, he was still in the lower levels, cuffed and bleeding. A guard on each side. They had dragged him away while she watched. He hadn't resisted, just turned once, looked at her, and gave that same tired smile. The one that said, let them do what they want. I already chose. The lead judge rose. Scout Rhina, he said, voice sharp and colorless. You are charged with violation of engagement protocol. You made contact with a hostile species, shared fire, medical aid, and shelter. Do you deny these charges? Rhina raised her chin. No. Gasps rippled through the assembly. Some covered their mouths, others shook their heads. The judge took a step down from the dais. Do you understand what this means? I do. He nodded once. Then say the words. Say you were wrong. She looked at him, then around the hall. She saw her commander, stone-faced, her instructors, shaking their heads in silent disbelief. Even her family was here, watching from the rear row, eyes cold, as if they didn't recognize her anymore. She looked at her hands, the same hands that had held a dying man, that had stopped the bleeding, that had touched his face when he whispered thank you. I won't say it, she said. Silence, the kind of silence that swallows sound. The judge's voice dropped low. You shame your people. No, she replied. I honor someone who didn't have to save me but did. A low hum of voices rose in the crowd. Confusion, outrage, disbelief. Then the doors opened again. 2 guards escorted Cade into the hall. He looked thinner than before, pale, limping. But he walked under his own strength, his eyes never leaving her. When he reached the center, they shoved him into the chair beside her. He didn't look at the council. He looked at her. Hey, he said, voice like gravel. Still standing? She gave him the barest smile. Barely. The judge pointed. You go with him, exile. No rank, no name, no protection. Cade looked at Rhina. You don't have to do this. She shook her head. I already did. He reached out slowly. She took his hand. They walked together toward the doors, as the court shouted behind them. Warnings, condemnation, disbelief. None of it mattered. They had walked into this together. They would walk out together, through the grand chamber, down the long stair, past every face that once believed humans had no soul. And when the doors closed behind them, Rhina whispered softly, This isn't exile. Cade looked at her. Then what is it? She didn't answer with words. She just held his hand tighter. And together, they walked toward whatever came next. The air outside the chambers was sharper, quieter, no more echoes, no more eyes watching from above, just the long stone path ahead. framed by towering walls of pale glass that shimmered in the morning light like distant stars. Behind Rena and Cade, the gate groaned shut with finality. There would be no return, no plea, no second hearing. They were alone now, truly. Cade walked with a limp, one hand pressed lightly to his ribs. The cuffs had been removed, but the bruises remained, dark fingerprints of a system that had never meant to let him leave alive. Rina matched his pace in silence. Her coat, no longer marked with any insignia, flapped gently in the wind. The rank had been stripped from her shoulders, her name removed from the scout registry. She had been erased from the collective, but her soul felt clearer than it had in years. They didn't speak as they walked, not at first. What could be said after a trial like that? After choosing exile for the sake of someone her kind called a beast? After standing before the eyes of her own family and saying she would rather be cast out than betray what her heart had seen? Cade broke the silence first. "You didn't have to do that," he murmured, eyes forward. Rina glanced at him. "I know." He nodded slowly. "Still, you did." They reached the top of a ridge where the city faded into the horizon. Beyond it, wilderness, unclaimed land. No outposts, no patrols. Just wind, ruins, and open sky. Cade took a shaky breath. "You know this isn't going to be easy." Rina gave a faint smile. "Since when has anything between us been easy?" He huffed a laugh, winced, then looked at her with something more than gratitude. It was weight, understanding, and a hint of awe. "What now?" he asked. She looked out over the horizon, then reached into her satchel and pulled out a small folded piece of metal, bent and dark, the very shard she had used to kill the beast. She turned it in her hands. "Now," she said, "we survive. Together." A simple answer, but the most powerful one. As they continued walking, the sun rose higher, casting long shadows behind them. Two figures marked by different worlds, now walking as one. They came upon an abandoned transport node, half buried in sand. Inside was shelter, broken panels, an old heater that flickered weakly to life, with some coaxing. Rina set it up while Cade collapsed into a corner, his energy finally giving out. "You rest," she said. "I'll stand watch." But before she turned, his hand reached out and caught hers. "You sure?" Rina looked at him. "No," she said honestly. "But I'm sure about you." He let go, a quiet smile settling on his lips. She stepped to the entrance of the shelter, blade in hand, her back straight against the dawn. And for the first time since the war began, she no longer felt like a scout or a soldier. She felt like something new, something unchained. The new world was quiet in a different way, not the silence of war, of bodies buried under ash and rubble, not the silence of judgmental courts and locked doors. This was the hush of wind through alien grass, of distant birds with unfamiliar songs, of a place untouched by flags or borders. Cade stirred first, his eyes opened slowly, blinking into the soft amber light pouring through the cracked roof of the old transport shelter. The heater beside him buzzed faintly, still working despite all odds. His body ached, but not with fear, not with pain that threatened to swallow him whole. Just the weight of rest and recovery. And something like peace. Rina was already outside. He saw her silhouette through the open hatch, standing atop a nearby rise, her back to him, hair caught in the breeze, armor coat flaring slightly at the edges. She had her blade strapped across her back now, not held tight in her hand, a different kind of readiness. He stood, slowly, walked toward her with a limp that had become part of his rhythm. When he reached her, she didn't turn at first. The sunrise stretched across the horizon, in long golden ribbons, painting the clouds in soft flame. The land ahead was wild, rolling hills, sparkling mist, alien trees that shimmered slightly with every gust of wind. "No one knows this place exists," she said quietly. Cade stood beside her. "Feels like it was waiting for us." She looked at him then, eyes tired but steady. "You're not what I expected," she said. "When they told us about humans, they said you were all teeth and fury, rage and chaos." He smiled softly. "That's not completely wrong." She didn't smile, but she stepped closer. "You changed me," she said. "And you changed me," he replied. "Guess that makes us even." She shook her head. "Number it makes us dangerous. Because we've seen both sides. And we still chose each other." The wind shifted. She pulled something from her satchel and placed it into his hand. A small crystal disc etched with her people's sigil of truth. A symbol she should not have kept. One they would have taken from her the moment they exiled her. "I want you to have it," she said. Cade turned it over in his fingers. "What does it mean?" "It means I don't belong to them anymore," she said. "I belong here." She reached for his hand, laced her fingers through his. "And here," she added, placing his palm over her heart. The sun rose higher, catching the side of his face. She looked at him like he was the only light that mattered. "You once said you just wanted to make it home," she whispered. "I did," he said. "Then welcome home," she replied. They stood like that for a long time. Two soldiers without nations, without orders, without ranks, just hearts, just memory, just the road ahead. Somewhere in the sky, a satellite blinked. Somewhere in the past, a war sputtered out. But here, on this forgotten world, a new story was starting. It didn't begin with conquest. It began with a girl who hesitated to shoot, and a man who snapped his own arm back into place and kept smiling through the pain.